Welcome to Nightingale Stories, where mysteries come to life. Don't forget to like this video and share it with fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started with Chapter 1. The quiet arrival at St. Mary's was unusually still that autumn morning, the rising sun painting the neat hedgerows in muted gold. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her parlor window, observed every detail with calm curiosity as she took in the wisp of chimney smoke drifting from the nearby cottages, the gentle clop of a milk cart, and Mrs. Baker's tabby cat skulking across the vicarage lawn. Despite the tranquility, Miss Marple sensed a faint unease stirring in the crisp air. No sooner had she finished her breakfast of lightly buttered toast than a knock sounded at the door. It was her dear friend, Mrs. Dolly Gantry, her face aglow with both excitement and concern. "Jane," she whispered conspiratorially, "you'll never guess, there's been the strangest talk at the post office, something about peculiar comings and goings at Maplewood Inn just outside the village." Miss Marple smiled politely, setting aside her knitting. "Indeed," she murmured, her eyes bright with interest. Word had reached the villagers that Maplewood Inn, an old coaching house now converted into a modest hotel, was hosting an unusual collection of guests. Mrs. Gantry, eager for a diversion from her otherwise humdrum day, proposed they enjoy afternoon tea there. "Just the two of us," she said. "To see what we can see." Miss Marple agreed, for she had always found a certain satisfaction in observing human nature, particularly when something didn't appear quite right. By 2 o'clock, the pair found themselves at Maplewood's ivy-clad. The doorstep inside the parlor exuded a genteel charm, faded floral wallpaper, a scattering of brick-red armchairs, and the faint scent of lavender polish. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. A kindly maid showed them to a table near the window where they ordered tea and a slice of sponge cake. Miss Marple allowed her eyes to wander, noting details with practiced care. Seated by the hearth was Colonel Moody, a man whose stern bearing and neatly trimmed mustache spoke of his military past. He appeared to be reading, but Miss Marple noticed he rarely turned a page. Occasionally he glanced at the door as though expecting someone or dreading their arrival. Near the piano sat a gentleman in an immaculate suit with a silver-headed cane and a slight stoop. Mrs. Gantry identified him as Mr. Roland Hamilton, formerly of the banking world. He wore an air of affable charm, yet Miss Marple detected a faint restlessness in his tapping fingers. A third figure soon caught her attention, Miss Charlotte White, an unassuming librarian from a nearby town. Quiet, almost timid, she kept, mostly to herself, but Miss Marple saw her jump every time the parlor door opened, nervous or shy, it was difficult to say. Meanwhile, bustling about was Mrs. Beryl Haywood, the proprietress, a woman with fixed smiles and barely concealed anxiety in her eyes. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, a polite conversation sprang up between her and Mrs. Haywood, who confessed with forced cheer that business at Maplewood had been a touch slow. She looked anxiously at Colonel Moody. He returned her glance with a frown, then hurriedly rose and disappeared into the corridor. Mrs. Gantry's eyebrows arched, but it was Miss Marple who asked, "Is the Colonel quite all right?" Mrs. Haywood hesitated, fiddling with the edge of her apron. "He's had a difficult week," she offered uncertainly, before hurrying away to greet the new arrival. Miss Marple's gentle gaze swept the room again, lingering on each face, something hanging unspoken in the air, a shared tension or a delicate secret no one dared mention. She observed small signs, Colonel Moody's constant watch of the doorway, Mr. Hamilton's drumming fingers, Miss White's anxious posture, and Mrs. Haywood's trembling voice. Whatever the cause, it seemed all too likely that Maplewood was about to become the stage for a drama of secrets, suspicions, and possibly something more troubling. And Miss Marple, with her quiet yet penetrating insight, intended to be right there in the front row, studying the cast as each played their part. Chapter 2, Shadows at Dovecot Cottage. By the soft glow of early morning light, St. Mary Mead awakened with a gentle rustle of activity. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her parlor window, regarded the tidy lawns and hedgerows with the discerning eye of one who knew every inch of the village, its gossip, its secrets, its quiet joys. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, reflecting on the curious events at Dovecot Cottage the previous evening, where a stifled shriek had been heard echoing through the stillness. No one seemed certain where it came from or who had uttered it. But in St. Mary Mead, such mysteries never remained unsolved for long. Determined to discover if anything truly sinister had occurred, Miss Marple ventured out into the. On the lane, she soon encountered Mrs. Dolly Gantry, a dear friend and noted enthusiast of anything slightly scandalous. Mrs. Bantu's eyes gleamed with excitement. "My dear Jane," she exclaimed, "people were saying that poor Miss Livonia Brent was seen running from her own house in a dreadful state. She claimed she was startled by a prowler. You can imagine how this talk sets tongues wagging. I saw," murmured Miss Marple in her placid tone, belying the quick calculations of her mind. Miss Livonia was by nature a timid soul, always flinching at sudden noises, yet she was no fantasist. "Something genuine must have frightened her." "Yes," Miss Marple continued softly. "I must have a little chat with her. If only to soothe her nerves." Their path soon crossed with that of the ever-watchful Miss Martle, who was brimming with a fresh bit of gossip. "Good morning, Miss Marple, Mrs. Gantry," she said, feigning casualness. "You'll never guess, Dr. Haddock was summoned to Dovecot Cottage at dawn." Apparently, Miss Brent was in such a state that she nearly fainted twice. After exchanging a few sympathetic remarks, Miss Marple pressed on alone, weaving her way through the rose-hedged gardens until she reached the low stone walls surrounding Dovecot Cottage. She was struck by how ordinary everything looked: neat flower beds, a polished knocker, and pale curtains drawn neatly aside. Only the drawn expression on Miss Brent's face, glimpsed from the window, hinted at the unrest within. Upon entering, Miss Marple found Miss Brent perched on the edge of an armchair, clutching a handkerchief as though it were a lifeline. The poor woman's voice trembled. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered. "I was certain I had heard footsteps in the garden last night. Then I heard that awful cry. I raced to the window and could swear I saw a figure slipping into the shadows." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her. There, my dear," she soothed. "Dr. Hayek has seen to you. I hope rest is the best remedy for shock." Yet even as she spoke, Miss Marple's gaze swept the cottage interior. Her eyes lingered on a tea tray with 2 cups, both bearing faint lipstick stains. Miss Brent lived alone. Had she entertained a visitor prior to this frightful event? Their conversation was interrupted by a light knock, and in stepped Inspector Slack. Looking rather stiff and officious, he inquired briskly about any signs of forced entry. Miss Brent shook her head. "Nothing's missing, Inspector, only my peace of mind," she said, her voice tremulous. Miss Marple observed a curious flicker of relief pass across Miss Brent's features, at odds with her outward nervousness. There was more to this situation, Miss Marple felt certain, than a mere fright in the dark. Perhaps a visitor had upset Miss Brent. Perhaps something had been said, something unsettling enough to linger in her mind and echo as that midnight cry. Bidding Miss Brent farewell, Miss Marple stepped back out into the tidy lane. Behind the calm facade of St. Mary Mead, she was sure a secret stirred, ready to reveal itself under her gentle but penetrating scrutiny. And as she walked home, the specter of those unseen footsteps followed, a silent reminder that danger often lurked even amid the village's most tranquil gardens. Chapter 3: Quiet Suspicions. The morning sun streamed softly through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cozy drawing room. Illuminating the delicate patterns upon the wallpaper, she smiled as she rose from her chair, recalling the events at Dovecot Cottage. Though no new alarm had disturbed the village, Miss Marple sensed something simmering beneath St. Mary Mead's placid surface. She decided upon a short walk to the High Street. Passing the church, she spied the Reverend Leonard Clement straightening the flower arrangements by the gate. He greeted her with a gentle smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Off to see Miss Brent, are you?" "I hear she's quite anxious still." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, a thoughtful crease appearing between her brows. "These unsettled nerves don't suit her. I believe a friendly visit may help her feel more secure." Yet before Miss Marple could continue, Victor lowered his voice. "Inspector Slack dropped by earlier," he confided. "He was quietly making inquiries about who might have visited Miss Brent on the night of that dreadful shriek." Miss Marple nodded, thanking him for the information. She proceeded along the cobbled path, pausing at Mrs. Riley's well-tended rose bushes. The formidable lady herself appeared at the gate wearing a wide-brimmed hat and an expression of mild disapproval. "Miss Brent is too delicate, if you ask me," she declared. "Without making such a fuss about a mere noise in the night. And now the inspector is poking about as though there's been a murder." She gave an exaggerated sigh, though Miss Marple noted the quick flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Even trifling disturbances can cause real distress, Mrs. Riley," Miss merely remarked politely, "especially for those inclined to nerves." She continued on her way, reflecting how St. Mary's greatest joy and curse was its endless stream of speculation. Finally, Miss Merely arrived at Dewcote Cottage. Miss Livonia Brent greeted her at the threshold, hands trembling despite her bravest smile. In the parlor, a bright patchwork quilt and a profusion of dainty teacups brought cheer to the modest space. Nevertheless, Miss Brent's anxious gaze darted toward the window more than once. After exchanging pleasantries, Miss Merely gently steered the conversation. "I understand the doctor came by yesterday," she said, accepting a cup of chamomile tea. "I do hope you're feeling better." Miss Brent clasped her teacup tightly. "Yes, he was kind, though I'm afraid my nerves aren't what they used to be. I was so certain I saw a figure in the garden that night. I cannot get the image out of my head." Softly, Miss Merely ventured, "You had a guest earlier that evening." I believe her eyes flicked ever so briefly to the side table where a single white glove lay forgotten. Miss Brent lowered her gaze. "Yes, I had a friend calling. He left at dusk. We simply discussed some parish affairs." She hesitated. "I really think there's nothing more to it." Miss Merely might have accepted that had she not noticed the faint flush crossing Miss Brent's cheeks when she spoke. Instead, she merely smiled and changed the subject, all the while storing away that small detail for later consideration. Outside, the autumn air was bright, the leaves rustling with a crisp promise of change. As Miss Marple made her way home, she found Inspector Slack waiting by her gate, notebook in hand. He greeted her with a businesslike nod. "We've had a report of footprints in the lane behind Dovecote Cottage," he said, frowning. "Looked like a man's boots by the size of them." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet interest. "Most curious. I wonder if Miss Brent's friend might have lingered longer than she believes." She paused, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Of course, there are always others passing through. One never knows quite what secrets folk carry." The inspector sniffed. "She's a timid thing, but nerves alone don't explain everything." He tipped his hat and turned away, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts resting by the garden gate. Miss Marple gazed across the village rooftops at how often she had observed that seemingly ordinary people sometimes perform the most extraordinary acts. Acts born of fear, desperation, or the desire to keep up appearances. Dovecote Cottage held a secret, she felt certain, and, with the quiet diligence that so often served her well, she vowed to uncover it before any harm befell Miss Brent or anyone else under St. Mary Mead's peaceful facade. Chapter 4 An unexpected visitor to St. Mary Mead awoke the following day to a silvery drizzle, the sort that made the cobblestones glisten and lent the hedge roses a fresh dewy sheen. Despite the weather, Miss Marple rose early, intent on continuing her quiet investigation into the recent disturbances at Dovecote Cottage. Dressing in her sensible tweed skirt and cardigan, she set out with her trusty umbrella, her mind brimming with possibilities. Her first stop was the village post office is run by the ever-watchful Miss Pallet, who seemed delighted to catch a glimpse of Miss Marple on a busy morning. Miss Pallet chirped, passing a handful of letters across the counter. They say poor Miss Brent hardly slept a wink last night. I wondered what or who could be haunting her, so Miss Marple inclined her head, adopting a sympathetic expression. Oh, I do hope she's feeling better. One can hardly blame her for being nervous with so many odd goings-on. Still, I'm sure the dear girl could do with a friendly face or two. Armed with her letters, Miss Marple went next to the greengrocer's, where she encountered Colonel Gantry engaged in talk with Dr. Hawk. The colonel tipped his hat politely. "Morning, Miss Marple, you've heard the latest, I take it." Inspector Slack paid Miss Brent a visit at dawn. Seems he wanted to follow up on some footprints found near her back gate. "Oh dear," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes darting to Dr. Hawk, whose normally calm features were drawn in a thoughtful frown. "Footprints again. But do they point to anything conclusive, Colonel?" The colonel merely shrugged, though Dr. Hawk cleared his throat. "Apparently not," he said quietly, though Slack is convinced there's more to the matter. Miss Brent remains reticent, which only raises his suspicions. Miss Marple offered a gentle smile in return. Sometimes people withhold details out of fear or embarrassment. "Doctor. That doesn't necessarily mean they're guilty of wrongdoing." Dr. Hawk nodded, yet his expression conveyed that he too suspected Miss Brent was withholding a secret, one that could be crucial to understanding this unsettling chain of events. After leaving the shop, Miss Marple decided to visit Miss Brent. The drizzle had lessened by then, and the scent of damp earth drifted through the cottage garden. Upon reaching Dovecote Cottage, she found the door answered not by Miss Brent but by an unexpected visitor, a tall, dark-haired man with a stern countenance and the faintest hint of a London accent in his voice. "Oh, I'm sorry," he stammered, his gaze briefly flicking to Miss Marple's inquisitive eyes. "I was just leaving." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly, stepping aside so he could pass. As he slipped past, she noticed the cuff of his overcoat was slightly muddied, as if he had been tramping through wet grass. The man offered a hurried nod and disappeared down the garden path. When Miss Marple stepped inside, she found Miss Brent seated in the parlor, her cheeks flushed. She looked distinctly agitated. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, forcing a smile, "how very kind of you to drop by. I was just speaking with an acquaintance." A gentle tilt of Miss Marple's head betrayed her curiosity. "I must confess I'm not familiar with him, my dear." "A friend from outside the village?" A slight tremor ran through Miss Brent's hands as she clasped them in her lap. "Something like that," she whispered. Her manner suggested she was not inclined to elaborate. Sensing Miss Brent's unease, Miss Marple took the seat nearest the window, affording her a discreet view of the garden. The drizzle had returned, forming little pools across the lawn, and she and Miss Brent exchanged idle chat about the weather and the new rose varieties. Miss Marple's keen gaze noted small details, a half-packed valise in the corner, a recent tear stain on Miss Brent's embroidered tablecloth. Each sign hinted at underlying tension. Presently, Miss Brent apologized for her distraction, explaining she had errands to run in the village. Politely, Miss Marple said her goodbye, promising to call again soon. Stepping back out into the damp lane, she found her mind brimming with questions. Who was the mysterious stranger, and why had he visited so early in the day? Could he be the man Miss Brent had seen prowling outside, or had he come to offer her some form of assistance? With each new puzzle, Miss Marple's conviction deepened that something more than idle fancy haunted Dovecote Cottage. Standing beneath her umbrella, she gazed at the shuttered window, reflecting that in St. Mary, secrets seldom remained hidden for long, especially once Miss Jane Marple set her gentle but penetrating mind to solving them. Chapter 5, Rumors and Revelations. A soft haze lay over St. Mary Mead the next morning, giving the village an almost ethereal glow. Dew glistened on every leaf, and a faint mist clung to the church spire. Miss Marple, always an early riser, took her customary stroll after breakfast, greeting neighbors as she went. Though the dawn chorus of birds sounded as sweet as ever, there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, an expectation that something was about to happen. Her first call was at the vicarage, where the Reverend Leonard Clement met her in the drive, boots muddied from tending his flower beds. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, his voice harboring a trace of excitement, "have you heard about our new visitor? The mysterious fellow seen at Dovecote Cottage was spotted at the King's Arms last night." Indeed, the King's Arms was the only public house in St. Mary's, and visitors there rarely went unnoticed. Miss Marple thanked him for the information, marveling at how quickly gossip spread. Yet, she made her way to the church gardens as she had planned to deliver a small posy to the altar. While adjusting the flowers in a vase, she observed the Reverend's wife, Grizzly, engaged in urgent whispers with Mrs. Gantry. Their faces bore expressions of concern and intrigue. Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if they were discussing the same stranger. Next, she crossed the lane to see how Miss Lena Brent fared. Dovecote Cottage looked oddly forlorn, shutters still drawn at an hour when most villagers were already about their tasks. Miss Marple knocked gently and was surprised to find the door opened by the very gentleman she had glimpsed the previous day. This time, he appeared calmer, though a faint cloud of worry still seemed to hover over him. He said, recognizing her instantly, Miss Brent had stepped out for a moment. "She asked me to remain here in her absence." His tone was carefully polite, though his posture radiated discomfort. Miss Marple's eyes swept the small entryway with practiced thoroughness, noticing a broken vase carefully wrapped in newspaper by the hall table. "I hope all is well, Mr." She let the question hang, an invitation for him to supply his name. He hesitated just a fraction of a second. "Squires," he replied, offering a tight-lipped smile. "Raymond Squires, I'm an old friend." There was a trace of uncertainty in his voice, which Miss Marple noted. "I see," she said gently. "I do hope Miss Brent is feeling better. Dovecote Cottage has been a place of worry these last few days." Before he could reply, she added, "If you'll be so good as to inform her that I had called, I would be most obliged." With that, Miss Marple stepped back into the lane, suspecting that Raymond Squires might not be entirely straightforward about his relationship with Miss Brent. Had they quarreled? Or was Miss Brent struggling with a problem, financial, perhaps, that necessitated a secret arrangement? Determined to glean more, Miss Marple took the path behind Dovecote Cottage, where she had heard footprints had been found. It meandered through a hedge and opened onto a small clearing. Here, Miss Marple crouched carefully, noting the soft earth. She discovered faint impressions in the ground, large footprints pressed deep, suggesting a heavier man than Mr. Squires, and some smaller ones, no doubt Miss Brent. Yet there was another set too, lighter than the first but unmistakably not made by a dainty shoe. Could they belong to a second visitor? Her musings were interrupted by the sound of a snapping twig. Looking up, she saw Inspector Slack standing a few yards away, his notebook tucked under one arm. He regarded her with a mixture of respect and exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said briskly, "I might have known I'd find you here. You've a nose for trouble, no mistake." Smiling pleasantly, Miss Marple rose. Just observing, Inspector. Sometimes one notices more in the hush of a country lane than in a bustling parlor. Slack eyed her suspiciously. Let me remind you, this is official business. There have been concerns about Miss Brent's welfare, and that chap Squires, something about him doesn't quite add up. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, her expression calm. Do keep me informed if you learn anything new, Inspector. I'm sure we both have Miss Brent's best interests at heart. With a nod, Slack walked on, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She turned back toward the village, the soft hush of the clearing giving way to the distant hum of midday life. As she stepped carefully over the footprints, Miss Marple's mind filled with questions. Who else had been lurking behind the cottage? What secrets was Miss Brent concealing? And how did Raymond Squires fit into the puzzle? In the gentle sunshine of St. Mary Mead, the shadow of suspicion grew ever longer. Yet Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, felt surer than ever that the truth would soon emerge. In Chapter 6, a shimmer of doubt, light rain drummed quietly on the windows of Miss Marple's neat little parlor the next morning, lending the room a cozy warmth. Undeterred by the dampness, she donned her waterproof cape and set out toward the high street, her mind fixed upon the various pieces of the puzzle surrounding Miss Brent. Somewhere amid the footprints, the broken clues, and the mysterious Raymond Squires lay a truth that Miss Marple felt was tantalizingly close. Halfway down the lane, she encountered Mrs. Gantry, who waved her over beneath the shelter of an old oak. Jane, Mrs. Gantry began in hushed tones. Excitement. I've just come from tea with Grizzly Clement. She mentioned something rather peculiar. Apparently, Miss Brent had been spotted taking solitary walks quite late in the evening along that overgrown footpath near the abandoned mill. It seemed most unusual for a timid woman like her. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows in mild surprise at how curious she replied, tucking the information away. I can't imagine Miss Brent choosing such a lonely route unless she had pressing reasons. I do hope she isn't putting herself in danger. The two women parted ways, and Miss Marple made for the post office. Within its snug confines, Miss Pallet, ever the gossip, greeted her with eager chatter. We've had a telegram this morning addressed to Miss Brent, she whispered confidentially. The sender's name was smudged, but it looked like it began with. Might it be from Mr. Squire's odd business? I say. Miss Marple accepted her own post and thanked Miss Pallet, reflecting on how a telegram might signify urgency if it were indeed from Mr. Squire. Perhaps it held a clue to the nature of his relationship with Miss Brent, yet she knew better than to pry directly. Knowledge gleaned secondhand often proved more revealing than a forced explanation. A short while later, Miss Marple braved the persistent drizzle to call upon Miss Brent. The windows of Dovecote Cottage glowed with lamplight, though the curtains were drawn tightly. Miss Marple rapped gently on the door. After a moment, it opened to reveal Miss Brent, pale and drawn. A slight tremor in her voice betrayed her inner turmoil. Miss Marple, she said, forcing a smile. How kind of you to come. I've been feeling a trifle under the weather. Seated in the parlor, Miss Marple noted that the broken vase was still nowhere to be seen, and the half-packed trunk she had glimpsed earlier had vanished from sight. A faint musty smell clung to the air, as though Miss Brent hesitated, her eyes flicking anxiously to the window. I'm sure it's nothing, she murmured, pressing her hands together. Everyone seemed so concerned about me, but I'm afraid I had little to offer by way of an explanation. Before Miss Marcel could press further, there came a sudden knock at the door. Startled, Miss Brent hurried to answer it. This time, Inspector Slack stood on the threshold, rain dripping from his hat with his usual briskness. He announced that he was following up on reports of unusual comings and goings at the cottage. Miss Brent stiffened while Miss Marple discreetly observed every shift in her expression. "I've had word," Slack said, "that someone was seen lurking around here after dark. I'd like to know, Miss Brent, if you've noticed anyone unwelcome." Miss Brent swallowed hard. "No, no one," she stammered, yet a subtle tension in her posture suggested otherwise. She clutched the doorknob so tightly that her knuckles whitened. With a small polite cough, Miss Marple excused herself, sensing that Inspector Slack's interrogation might be more direct if she were absent. As she stepped out into the rain-soaked garden, she glanced back to the parlor window. Chapter 7: Secrets Beneath the Moonlight. A pale half-moon hung low over St. Mary Mead that evening, casting long wavering shadows across the lanes. The village, so tranquil by day, seemed cloaked in an air of expectancy. As though every window concealed a watcher and every corner held an echo of some whispered confidence. Miss Marple, ever attuned to such undercurrents, found herself unable to rest. She wrapped a warm shawl around her shoulders and settled in her fireside chair, thoughts drifting inevitably to Miss Livonia Brent. Earlier that day, Miss Marple had spied the timid young woman hurrying along the edge of the churchyard. Her expression pale and drawn, Miss Brent had clutched her handbag tightly as if fearful of losing something precious. Had it been merely her nerves, or was she truly guarding a secret? Miss Marple recalled how Inspector Slack had pressed her for answers and how the mysterious Mr. Raymond Squires had arrived and departed under such tense circumstances. Each time she turned the puzzle over in her mind, new questions arose. Desiring fresh insight, Miss Marple stepped onto her porch and paused, listening to the subdued hush of the village night. In the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent down the lane. A single light burned in the vicarage window. Perhaps the Reverend and Mrs. Clement lingered over late-night reading, yet Miss Marple's focus lay elsewhere. Dovecote Cottage nestled in darkness with only the barest sliver of lamplight escaping through a gap in the curtains. Summoning a quiet resolve, she strolled along the deserted road. The moonlight revealed footprints on the damp ground, her own footsteps from earlier visits crisscrossed by others. As she approached the cottage, she noticed the garden gate ajar. Inside, faint rustles suggested that someone had moved about in the overgrowth. A cat might have made such a noise, or a stealthy figure. Miss Marple's gentle heart fluttered, but she pressed on, curiosity tempered by calm determination. She was about to knock at the front door. Abruptly opened. There stood Raymond Squires, his face torn with quiet. He appeared taken aback by Miss Marple's unexpected presence, but he swiftly recovered. "Good evening," he managed to keep his voice subdued. "I was just leaving." "Miss Brent quite well?" Miss Marple asked, peering past him into the narrow hallway. She glimpsed scattered papers on the small side table and a hat tossed hastily upon the coat stand. He replied too quickly, "She's resting. I was helping her settle some personal affairs." His tone hovered between politeness and desperation, as though he was clinging to a fragile illusion of normalcy. Miss Marple inclined her head, stepping back so he could slip past. There was mud splashed high on the cuffs of his trousers, revealing he had run off the path, quite possibly in haste. "Do give her my regards," she said softly, watching as he nearly fled down the lane. Left alone, Miss Marple chose not to intrude on Miss Brent at such a late hour. Instead, she took a careful turn around the garden, discovering that a low side window stood open just wide enough for someone to enter or leave discreetly under the moon's illumination. She caught sight of footprints in the soft earth below the sill. They appeared fresh, imprinting the ground with a distinct tread. Her eyes narrowed, thoughts spinning with the implications of a secret entrance or exit. The next morning, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, resolved to seek counsel from a trusted friend. Mrs. Dolly Gantry, always eager to discuss anything intriguing, arrived promptly for tea. Over the gentle clink of cups and saucers, Miss Marple recounted her nighttime observations. Mrs. Bantu's eyes widened, concern mingling with excitement. "It's most peculiar," she whispered. And Miss Brent, if only she could confide in someone while sipping her tea. Miss Marple explained her suspicion that Miss Brent's predicament involved more than fear of a nocturnal prowler. "Human nature," she said gently, "often leads the most unassuming people to desperate acts when threatened or beholden to another. I'm convinced Miss Brent was struggling with something that had snared her and that Mr. Squires was involved." Mrs. Gantry leaned forward eagerly, but Miss Marple merely shook her head. "I'd rather not speculate aloud," she murmured. "Not until I'm certain inside." However, her mind clicked with quiet assurance. The footprints by the window, the late-night visits, and the telegram from an unknown sender all formed a pattern. Miss Marple believed events would soon force the truth to emerge, and as she bid Mrs. Gantry farewell, she felt a distinct sense that the final unraveling was close at hand, like the tightening of a thread that would snap in sudden, startling clarity. Chapter 8, Truth at Div Cod Cottage. St. Mary Me awoke to a bright, clear morning, and with it a distinct air of anticipation. The mystery surrounding Miss Livonia Brent had gripped the village's imaginations, and whispers floated from garden fences to grocery queues. Miss Marple, as ever, greeted her neighbors politely while her mind worked over every clue, the footprints, the late-night visits, and Miss Brent's palpable fear. Shortly after breakfast, Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. Doing his hat with an air of weary frustration, "I've tried talking to Miss Brent again," he said grimly, but she refused to speak plainly. "And that fellow Squires, well, he's gone missing, at least for the moment. One of my constables saw him board the London bus last night." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "Indeed, and might one ask if he purchased a return ticket or one?" The inspector gave a rueful shrug. "The conductor only recalled him paying in haste, no mention of returning, but he left behind a few personal effects at Dovecote Cottage." Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "That suggests he intended to come back or that he left in such a rush he could not gather everything. Either possibility is telling." Encouraged by her calm insight, Inspector Slack invited Miss Marple to join him at Dovecote Cottage. The pair found Miss Brent pale but resolved, sitting by the parlor. The cottage felt strangely subdued, the curtains half-drawn despite the sunshine outside. Miss Brent clutched a small envelope in her lap, her knuckles whitening around its edges. I suppose you both ought to know," she began in a trembling voice, meeting Miss Marple's gentle gaze. "Mr. Squire and I knew each other years ago when I was younger. He helped me out of a difficult situation at a cost." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, and Miss Brent continued, voice faltering. "He reappeared suddenly, demanding that I repay him. When I hesitated, he threatened." She drew a shaking breath. "I allowed him to stay here, but the stress became unbearable. I thought I heard prowlers at night, but it was often just him returning late from who knows where." She paused, eyes flicking to the hearth. "I lied to everyone. I was ashamed." Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "You might have come to us for help." Miss Brent offered a sad smile. "You don't understand. I owed him money, but worse, I feared scandal. He claimed to possess letters that could harm my reputation if revealed. I wanted to keep my past secret. When the rumors spread about footsteps and screams, I panicked. I feigned ignorance, hoping everything would pass." At that moment, there was a gentle rap at the door, and in stepped Raymond Squires himself, looking contrite and exhausted. "I overheard your conversation with Livonia," he said quietly. "The guilt's been gnawing at me. I was wrong, holding those letters over you. The truth is, I lost my job in London. I needed money desperately, but I'm ashamed of what I've done." Inspector Slack moved towards him, but Miss Marple raised a hand with quiet authority. "You left in a hurry last night." Mr. Squires returned, running a hand through his hair. "Because I realized I couldn't go through with it. I destroyed the letters," and he produced a scorched envelope from his coat pocket, the edges singed. "I've no wish to blackmail anyone. I'm sorry, Lena." For a moment, silence settled over the parlor. Then Miss Brent, tears welling, whispered, I believe you. Oh, how foolish I've been. Letting shame rule me." Inspector Slack, though still wary, sensed the drama had run its course. There would be consequences, likely a fine, some legal matters to address, but the threat to Miss Brent's peace of mind was over. Outside, Miss Marple stepped into the brightness of the day. Pausing under the rose, Arch-Inspector Slack offered a gruff nod of appreciation. "You had it figured out all along, didn't you?" "Not entirely," she demurred, "but human nature so often repeats itself. Fear, desperation, and secrecy can lead people to do the most unfortunate things." Her voice grew gentle. Poor Miss Brent was trapped by her own sense of shame, and Mr. Squire by his desperation. Once one understands that, the rest follows. With the mystery at Dovecote Cottage resolved, St. Mary Mew's tranquil air returned, though for Miss Marple it was simply another reminder that beneath the veneer of village life, passions and regrets still brood. As she made her way home, she silently thanked her years of quiet observation for guiding her to the truth once more.